April 2025. At 6:45 in the morning, the Vatican's official bulletin confirmed what Rome was already beginning to whisper. Pope Francis had died. A stroke, cardiovascular collapse, 88 years old. But beyond the medical facts, something deeper had taken place. Not only the end of a pontificate, but the beginning of a battle that had been silent for years under the surface of the Roman Church. Inside the Plaza de San Pedro, the faithful were congregating, silent and solemn. The candles were flickering under the dome of Michelangelo. 12 years ago, white smoke had risen in that same square, pointing to the arrival of a new type of pope, Francisco, the Jesuit of Argentina, the reformer, the disruptor. But now the bells were ringing for him. The protocol was immediate. The papal apartment, sealed. The fisherman's ring, destroyed. The vacancy had begun. And as tradition requires, a new pope must be elected in a period of 20 days. This time, however, the election would not be a quiet transition. It would be a turning point, perhaps the most ideologically charged conclave of the modern era, because two men, two visions were now in the middle of the storm. If you like this content, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on this unfolding story. Do you want me to continue translating more of the text? On the one hand, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, the prelate of soft voice from the Philippines, a man loved by Francisco, elevated to the head of the powerful congregation for the evangelization of the peoples. For many, he embodied the future of the Church, a bridge between continents, cultures and creeds. His voice was peaceful. His theology was rooted in mercy, inclusion and dialogue. For the global South and the progressive bloc in Europe, he represented hope. On the other hand, Cardinal Robert Sarah, the Guinean theologian and former prefect of the Congregation for the Divine Worship, known for his silence, his austerity and his unbreakable adherence to tradition. For the conservatives of the whole world, he was the spiritual heir not only of Benedict XVI, but of centuries of inflexible orthodoxy, a man who saw the liturgy not as an adaptation but as a sacred armor. Comment number 1 if you support the progressive vision of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. Comment number 0 if you lean more towards Cardinal Robert Sarah's traditionalism, or simply subscribe to stay connected to all updates. Would you like to translate the following fragment as well? While the Vatican is preparing for the next papal conclave, two figures have emerged as the main candidates, each representing opposite visions of the future of the Catholic Church. On one side is Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, a man many consider the embodiment of the progressive ideals promoted by Pope Francis. On the other is Cardinal Robert Sarah, symbol of tradition, discipline and orthodoxy. The Church at this crucial moment is not geographically divided, but ideologically. The next pope will not only inherit the throne of St. Peter, he will inherit a deeply divided Church and shape the spiritual path of more than even 1,300 million Catholics around the world. Cardinal Robert Sarah, the defender of the sacred tradition. If Tagle represents the face of the future of the Church, Cardinal Robert Sarah is the voice of his past, a past that many Catholics believe must be preserved at all costs. Born in Guinea in 1945, Sarah was appointed cardinal by Pope John Paul II, and later designated as prefect of the Congregation for the Divine Cult and the Discipline of the Sacraments. He is known for his stoicism, discipline and spiritual intensity. Where Tagle speaks of dialogue, Sarah speaks of truth. Where Tagle leans towards cultural adaptation, Sarah remains firm in the temporal tradition. If you are moved by the intensity of this story, make sure to give it a like, share with others, and don't forget to subscribe. Sarah's public statements usually invoke the silence of God, the reverence of Mass, and the need for personal holiness. He is a strong defender of the traditional Mass in Latin and has frequently warned against the westernization of the Church, arguing that modern secular ideologies are corrupting the Catholic doctrine from within. For Sarah's followers, he is not just a candidate, he is a restoration, a man who can restore the sacred, reaffirm authority and stop the shift towards moral ambiguity. For his critics, however, Sarah represents a regression, a papacy that could reverse decades of pastoral openness and ecumenical effort. Some fear his rigidity, especially when it comes to gender, sexuality and interreligious dialogue. However, for many in Africa, Eastern Europe and even parts of Latin America, Cardinal Sarah offers clarity in a world increasingly full of spiritual confusion. A divided Church, not by geography, but by vision. Although both Tagle and Sarah come from outside Europe, their appeal transcends national borders, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, the progressive bridge born in Manila, Philippines. Luis Antonio Tagle ascended into the ecclesiastical hierarchy not by force or politics, but by his compassion and intellect. A kind-hearted theologian, he has often been described as a pastoral pope in waiting, appointed by Pope Francis as prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, a high-ranking official responsible for missionary work and the expansion of faith. Tagle quickly became one of Francisco's closest allies. His theology is deeply influenced by Vatican II, highlighting inclusion, mercy and cultural sensitivity. Tagle defends the synodality, a church that listens before speaking. Under his vision, decisions are not imposed from Rome, but arise from the dialogue between bishops, clerics and laymen from all over the world. He believes in a church that approaches the marginalized, the migrants, the forgotten. But for his critics, Tagle is too soft, too willing to give in to cultural trends. He is accused of diluting doctrine in favor of compassion. Some within the Vatican even fear that a papacy of Tagle will dismantle the last barriers that protect the Catholic identity of modern relativism. Even so, his defenders argue the opposite. Tagle represents a church that does not fear the world, but is ready to dialogue with it. Tension does not revolve around faith itself, but rather how faith should respond to the modern world. Is the church called to adapt and dialogue, or to resist and purify itself? The electors and their calculations at a closed door. The cardinal electors, those under 80 years old with the right to vote, are already aligned. Approximately 130 cardinals will enter the Sistine Chapel for the next conclave. Of them, most were appointed by Francisco himself. On paper, this could favor a progressive candidate like Tagle, but Vatican politics is rarely simple. Although many cardinals share Francisco's pastoral sensitivity, they may hesitate to choose someone who is seen as a direct continuation of his legacy. The scandals of the last decade, poor financial management, internal resistance, and the German synodal path, have made some prelates act cautious. Tagle finds support among bishops from Latin America, Asia, and some parts of Europe, who were profoundly influenced by Pope Francis's emphasis on the poor, the peripheries, and the synodality. His coalition believes that the Church must evolve, not in doctrine, but in its approach and language. They see a world that moves away from faith, and they want a pope who understands the complexity of modern life. Sarah, on the other hand, obtains the strength of Curia officials, conservative clerics, and young priests, who seek stability. Her supporters usually point out the growing interest of young people for traditional liturgy, and the longing for spiritual depth in a distracted world. For them, the next pope must be a guardian, not a reform. Leads to recent appointments and alliances. Some observers have pointed out recent episcopal appointments as subtle signs of where loyalties reside. In slave dioceses, both progressive and traditional bishops have risen, perhaps as part of an act of balance. In Africa, Sarah's influence is still strong. Seminars are flourishing there, and many of the young priests are trained in conservative theology. Meanwhile, in Latin America and Southeast Asia, a new generation of bishops, molded by the theology of liberation and the model of pastoral reach of Francis, continues to gain weight. All eyes are also on the Italian cardinal. Although neither Tagle nor Sarah are Italian, their support for the Italian bloc could be decisive. The clergy of Rome is still powerful, and although many were frustrated by the centralization during the pontificate of Francis, others were inspired by their vision of a truly global church. As the Catholic Church prepares for its most polarized conclave ideologically in decades, the division between left and right is not merely theological, it is geopolitical. The battle between Tagle and Sarah reflects much more than personal charisma or pastoral preference. It is a mirror of the tensions, hopes and crises of a globalized church. Latin America, legacy of liberation and the Francisco factor. In Latin America, where more than 40% of the world's Catholics reside, Pope Francis's spirit remains deeply rooted. His emphasis on pastoral care, attention to the poor, and distrust of doctrinal rigidity resonates strongly throughout the region. Many Latin American cardinals, particularly those appointed by Francis, see in Tagle a continuation of that spirit. But even here there is some bishops, disillusioned by the stagnation of reforms and the growing influence of secular politics, have begun to favor a return to a clear moral teaching. For them, Sarah's call to return to fundamental principles, especially on matrimonial, family and bioethical issues, is gaining traction. The continent may lean towards the progressive, but it is no longer monolithic. Africa, the conservative bastion Africa, represents the future of the Church in numerical terms. With one of the fastest growing Catholic populations in the world, African bishops exert an increasing influence on the decisions of the Vatican, and Cardinal Robert Sarah is his spiritual hero. He is not only admired, he is African bishops often speak clearly about moral issues and emphasize the fidelity to doctrine. They see Western Catholicism weakened by commitment and relativism. For many African prelates, a papacy of Tagle would be seen as a step towards a greater erosion of moral authority. In contrast, Sarah's orthodoxy without concessions has a strong appeal to bishops who navigate between cultures marked by a deep spirituality and a rapid modernization. Asia, the battlefield of commitment. Asia houses some of the most complex interreligious dynamics in the world. In countries such as India, China, and the native Philippines of Tagle, the Catholic Church must constantly navigate between cultural sensitivity and governmental hostility. Tagle's experience in this context is considered a great advantage. His gift for dialogue, especially with Muslims and Buddhists, and his calm and accessible attitude, make him the favorite candidate of much of the Asian episcopate. They see him as a unifier, a man capable of gently guiding the Church through turbulent environments, without resorting to confrontation. But Asia also has a growing cohort of bishops who distrust the appearance of being. These clerics observe in silence how a bold traditionalism could be received in contexts where Christianity is a minority and where firmness can be seen as a form of survival. Europe, a divided house. Europe, the traditional heart of Catholicism, is spiritually exhausted, but is still institutionally powerful. Its cardinals are still among the most influential in the debates of the Vatican, although their churches face dramatic falls in assistance and vocation. The European episcopate is fractured. The cardinals of Western Europe, especially in Germany, Belgium and Switzerland, support Tagle. They see his compassionate and inclusive approach as the only viable path in increasingly secular society. These cardinals are deeply committed to synodality, the reach to LGBT. They want a pope who draws clear moral lines, not to blur them. In Sarah, they see the type of firm leadership that they believe the Church has been needing. Within the marble corridors of the Roman Curia, the bureaucracy of the Church exerts its influence in silence. The curial officials are not a uniform bloc, but many have felt uncomfortable with the decentralizing reforms of Pope Francis. Sarah's emphasis on restoring the authority and clarity of Rome attracts many of them. His papacy would probably imply a return to a centralized government, a stricter discipline between the clergy and a revaluation of the liturgy in Latin. Tagle, in contrast, would probably continue with Francis's vision of a shared government and pastoral sensitivity. Some in the Curia see this as chaos, others see it as a renovation. The question is, what vision will be able to gather more support among supporters, media and public opinion? The new frontline. Although the conclaves are secret and the papers private, the battle for minds and hearts is free to all. The Catholic media around the world, particularly the major conservative media in EU and Italy, have already begun to present Sarah as the candidate for truth and firmness. In contrast, progressive Catholic publications and theologians celebrate Tagle as a figure of hope and inclusion. His image as a smiling, humble and accessible cardinal has been used effectively in public campaigns and opinion articles. Even secular media is paying attention. The idea of a papal confrontation between left and right has captured global imagination, and although the cardinals do not campaign publicly, the pressure of public perception and the desire not to seem disconnected from the global Catholic feeling could have a great influence on the final vote. Papal politics, behind the red doors. Inside the Sistine Chapel there will be no cameras or microphones, only conversations in a low voice, silent contemplation, and papers deposited in secret. But long before the conclave begins, the alliances are already formed. Tagle and Sarah are not just symbols, they are points of reference. The strength of Tagle lies in its ability to unite several continents under the flag of the legacy of Francis. It attracts cardinals who believe that the Church must continue to evolve to remain relevant. Sarah's strength lies in her clarity and conviction. It attracts cardinals who believe that the Church must resist the cultural tide and regain its sacred identity. There are also the indecisive ones, the Besigre cardinal. These men may not fully support either of the two visions, but they have the keys to the papacy. For them, the question is not just who should lead the Church, but what kind of church they want to see. In the heart of the next conclave, there is not only a political battle, it is a war of ideas. Tagle and Sarah represent two radically different visions of what Catholicism should be in the 21st century. This is not a question of personality, but of doctrine. Doctrine. The theology of Tagle. The Church of Accompaniment. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle
is often described as the Asian Francisco, and it is not just a nickname, it is a theological orientation. His pastoral model emphasizes accompaniment over condemnation and mercy over moral vigilance. His discourses are full of terms, such as encounter dialogue, a church that listens to peripheries. Tagle believes that the role of the church in today's world is not to exercise authority as a scepter, but to walk alongside the broken hearts, the excluded, and those who doubt. He is deeply inspired by the idea of Francisco de la Iglesia as a campaign hospital after the battle. In practical terms, this has meant opening to LGBT dialogue with Islam and other religions, without demanding theological concessions, support to synodality, empowering local bishops, and promoting listening sessions around the world, emphasis on mercy before norms, especially towards divorced Catholics and those who live in irregular union. For Tagle, compassion is not weakness, it is strength in the modern world, where people are disappointed, spiritually wounded, and skeptic of institutions. His critics, however, argument that his theology blurs the line between truth and tolerance. Sarah's theology, the militant church, the Cardinal, Robert Sarah, in contrast, talks with the attenuating tones of eternal truth. For him, the crisis of the modern church is not that it has failed to adapt, but that it has adapted too much. He warns about a church that risks becoming indistinguishable from the world. His favorite words include reverence, sacrifice, obedience, contemplation. He does not doubt calling sin by its name. He has publicly declared that the confusion about the moral doctrine is Satan's smoke entering the church. And although his tone is serene, his convictions are of forged steel. Under a papado of Sarah, it could be expected a firm reaffirmation of the teachings of the church about sexual, moral, gender, and the holiness of life, re-centralization of the authority in Rome, a return to liturgy in Latin and the traditional ornaments, as a visible sign of the whole, resistance to what he calls the dictatorship of relativism that infects Western society. His followers see him as a prophet of stability in chaotic times. His critics fear a retrocess of all pastoral advancements achieved under Francis. The Eucharistic division, liturgy as identity. The Eucharistic division. But even inside this camp, doubts persist. Is Tagle too soft, too gentle? Will he be able to face the ferocious opposition that surrounds the papal throne? Sarah's camp, the silent bloc. The supporters of Cardinal Sarah are less numerous, but are more ideologically aligned. They don't speak often, but when they do, everyone listens. Their intimate circle includes Cardinal Gerhard Müller, former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, a theological conservative who has openly criticized aspects of Pope Francis. Cardinal Raymond Bork, a magnate of traditionalism, marginalized during Pope Francis's reign, but still influential among bishops and conservative donors. Cardinal Dominik Duka, from Prague, along with several prelates from Poland, Hungary, and Africa, regions that see modern liberalism with deep mistrust. Curia officials who felt alienated during the decentralization of power driven by Francis, waiting in silence for a return to traditional structures. These men do not see Sarah as a reactionary, but as a reformer of reform, a man who will clean the house, restore discipline, and restore the sacred. Sarah's team bets on a wave of reaction, a back and forth between cardinals who believe that the church has deviated from the course. They know that they will probably not win in the first vote, but if they manage to avoid a clear majority and position Sarah as the candidate for compromise by consensus, seen as strong, spiritual, and with principles, they have an opportunity, and their silent ally, time. The longer the conclave, the more the fear of chaos will grow among the voters, and a decisive voice like Sarah's becomes more attractive. The floating voters, the European comedine. Not all cardinals clearly fall into the fields of Tagle or Sarah. Many, especially in Italy, Germany, and France, are indecisive, overlooking the risks of each option. Some admire Tagle's warmth, but fear his doctrinal ambiguity. Others respect Sarah's conviction, but fear a return to rigidity and isolation. This group will ultimately be the one to decide the conclave. It includes cardinals concerned with ecumenical relations and interreligious dialogue, cardinals from secularized cities in Europe, where mass attendance is in free fall, cardinals who see the role of the church as deeply linked to human rights and social action, rather than moral confrontation. The ghost of Francis in the room. Although he has died, the influence of Pope Francis still surrounds the conclave. Almost 75% of the cardinal voters were named by him. His theological footprints are everywhere, and his shadow covers every conversation. Some want to preserve his legacy, others want to bury it. Tagle is seen as the heir to that legacy, a spiritual son of Francis. Voting for Tagle is voting to continue the revolution that Francis began. Sara is seen as the correction, not necessarily against Francis as a person, but against the cultural changes that he allowed. Voting for Sara is voting to restore clarity and order, but even the closest allies of Francis know that the next pope cannot be Francis. The Church must evolve beyond its pontificate, and choose someone who can both lead and resist the pressures of the world. And so the cardinals are trapped between two narratives, one of reform and openness, a church that adapts, listens and walks with the margin, another of resistance and preservation, a church that proclaims difficult truths, without hesitation, regardless of the applause of the world. Both are powerful, both have saints behind them, both claim the Holy Spirit, secret files and strategically. Meanwhile, behind the sacred marble walls, files are passed, accusations are whispered, and documents are leaked. This is the Vatican, and every conclave has its rumor. There are already rumors circulating about concerns about the lack of administrative experience of Tagle, accusations that Sara's allies are being financed by ultra-conservative donors, investigations about the moral credibility of some cardinal electors, designed to discredit their influence. This is not a conspiracy, it is history. Every conclave since the Renaissance has been marked by political maneuvers, and today it is no different, only this time, the bets are bigger. Because the battle is not only for the Pope, it is for the soul of the Church. When the heavy doors of the Sistine Chapel were closed, and the world held its breath, the cardinal electors knew one thing: what would happen next would shape the next generation of Catholicism. No telephones, no cameras, only 117 men, their consciences, and the presence of history, looking from every wall covered with frescoes. Silence was absolute, interrupted only by prayers in Latin, and the soft scratching of the feathers on the parchment. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, the bridge builder born in the Philippines. Cardinal Tagle represents a church that speaks from the periphery. His charisma does not reside in loud statements, but in sincere humility and silent strength. He has long been a defender of migrants, the poor, and those forgotten by the machinery of wealth and war. For his followers, Tagle is more than a successor to Pope Francis. He is the embodiment of the future of the Church, global, inclusive, and pastoral. His theological compass points to mercy, dialogue, and evangelization through meeting, rather than condemnation. They see in him a spiritual father for a world that longs for tenderness. His critics, however, wonder if his kindness is sufficient to resist the pressures of doctrinal clarity and institutional discipline. Can a church already divided in 1,000 directions allow a pastor to lean so much towards dialogue? And yet, for millions, Tagle represents a path of compassion, a church less concerned with guarding doors and more committed to opening them. From Guinea, Cardinal Sara is the embodiment of silence, simplicity and conviction. Forged in suffering under a Marxist's dictatorship, and spiritually molded by centuries of Catholic tradition, Sara does not speak often, but when she does, her words resonate with gravity. For his followers, Sara is not just a man of God, she is a necessary correction for a church that many believe has strayed too far from its foundations. She represents orthodoxy, reverence, and the sacred mystery of liturgy. They see in him a rock, a spiritual anchor in a world adrift in moral ambiguity. His detractors argue that his vision of the world is too rigid, too nostalgic for an era to which the Church cannot return. In a world that demands compassion and adaptation, can a pope rooted in strict continuity respond to the complexity of modern? And yet, for many, Sara is exactly what the Church needs: a firm foothold in a world in constant change. The battle is not between enemies, but between visions. This is not a war between good and evil, nor between right and wrong. It is a confrontation between two deeply different interpretations of how the Catholic Church should live its eternal mission in a changing world. Should we look outward, speak gently, and lead with empathy, or look inward, remain firm, and speak with the authority of eternal truth? The next pope will not only administer the Vatican, but will mold the moral imagination of thousands of millions. He will confront secularism, political polarization, climate catastrophe, sexual abuse scandals, and interreligious tension. He will guide a church that loses faithful in the West and expands explosively in the global South. Final message, the soul of the Church. While the white smoke is preparing to rise once more over the eternal city, the question is not only who will wear the white. The question is, what type of church do we want to be? A church of mercy or a church of truth? A church that bends or a church that remains firm? A church that listens or a church that proclaims? Perhaps, if grace prevails, it is all those things. Because in the end, the church is not defined by the man who leads it, but by the God who sustains it. And that God, whether whispered in Tagalog or thrown in Latin, is the same. Let us pray, not for a candidate, but for a pastor, one who knows when to heal and when to guide, one who sees both the path traveled and the one ahead. The future of the Vatican, and perhaps the soul of the Church, now rests in the hands of those who are behind closed doors, but his heart has always belonged to the people. What direction do you think the Church should take? Leave us your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more analysis on the Vatican, prophecies and power.